So, to think about the end of World War II and its immediate aftermath, I'd like to begin first with the liberation of Paris. And you should have watched some of the films that give you images and what that must have felt like. And depending on who you were, the liberation felt very different. So, on the one hand, the liberation of Paris, an occupied city, was an urban spectacle filmed for everyone to see, as much for the reality of what was happening as for its symbolic significance. Now, it's important to remember that Paris had been occupied by the Nazis. In 1944, rather than have Paris handed over to the Allied forces, Hitler ordered for it to be destroyed, and explosive charges were placed in crucial sites. This was not about destroying government, but in fact destroying every symbol of Paris, iconic sites such as the Eiffel Tower. However, the Nazi general in charge refused to carry out the order, and Paris and its historic districts were saved, which was not the case in London or Berlin or other cities that were heavily bombed. So Paris emerged from the war unscathed. Still, this was a myth already in the making. The fact that people assumed the liberation was a moment of joy, release, and deliverance, a street festival where Allied forces were welcomed. And of course, there was that. But the reality was more complicated and more contradictory. Now, making this myth involved relying on gendered metaphors. That is, the liberation became embodied by the French woman, Mademoiselle, embracing her American savior. This was the American narrative. And indeed, sex again became a political metaphor. And if Paris was liberated, the war did not formally end until May 8th, 1945. Neither did violence end with the liberation, because joy came alongside vengeance and retribution as collaborators and Nazis were summarily arrested, punished, and even executed. And we see this with the Shorn women. Between 1944 and 1946, 24,000 women across the whole of France were arrested, their hair shaved, and swastikas drawn on foreheads or chests and paraded in public for the community to jeer at. They were accused of horizontal collaboration, that is, of sexual relationships with the German enemy. And in fact, that was a common accusation. The same accusation was made against Brasillac at his trial for collaboration. Now, in reality, that was rarely the case. These women had, for many reasons, worked or had working relationships with the occupier or represented the Vichy regime, now deemed illegitimate by the Free French. Again, sex stood in for the political. So these two moments side by side, the liberation of Paris and the Shorn women, suggest that the immediate post-war moment, the years between 1945 and 1950, were a time of transition, of working through complicated issues and making sense of it all as most emerged from the war eager to rebuild but also irredeemably transform. So to think about the post-war and what it means is to think about how this cataclysmic global event reshaped the world and people's lives and consumed both political leaders and ordinary people who wanted to forget, commemorate, and never repeat the mistakes of the past. That is, the chaos and death unleashed by fascism and Nazism. So I want to briefly recap what happened during World War II. World War II was an unprecedented event in different ways than World War I. More than 100 million people died across the world. More than 10 million were forcibly displaced, refugees. This was a global conflict, even more so than World War I, that went from Asia to Africa. And this, in fact, marked the era of the legitimation of war as violence against ordinary people, that is, violence against civilians, against the usual accepted rules of conflict. We need to remember that there was a genocide, the Holocaust, where over 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered. But there were also millions of others deemed unfit for life by the Nazis who were murdered. Gay men, Slavs, communists, political opponents to the Nazi regime, and even disabled people. And there was also the nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the war, where 250,000 men, women, and children died. So what happened during the war? Well, after 6 years of brutal, undemocratic, anti-Semitic regime, Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, leading to the opening of World War II. Hitler's aim was to create a Nazi empire predicated upon racial cleansing, mass murder of all European Jews and all those considered racially suspect, deviant, and, I quote, lives unworthy of life. In June 1941, the war took a turn for the worse, and that is against the non-aggression pact that had been signed with Stalin, where the Soviet Union and Germany agreed not to invade one another. In fact, Hitler invaded Russia. And this is the moment when Hitler sets up extermination camps, death camps, whose sole purpose was the mechanized and industrial murder of Jews at Treblinka, Chelmno, Sobibor, and others, all located in Poland. And these joined a large network of concentration and labor camps. So as I said, this was a war enacted against civilians. And in fact, they targeted first Jews, considered, and I quote, racial vermins. They also targeted Russians, for instance, prisoners of war, by deliberately starving them, but also starving Russian civilians during the Russian invasion. In fact, 60% of Russian soldiers died in captivity, as opposed to 5% during World War I, or 3% of British and American prisoners during World War II, which shows that to the Nazis, the Slavs, that is, Russians and all Eastern Europeans, were lower in their racial hierarchy. 90% of French civilians in internment camps returned, but they were damaged physically and psychologically. So in fact, the official numbers are that 9 million Soviet Russian soldiers and 19 million Russian civilians died during World War II, though historians now think the number is closer to 40 million. And 1941 is also the year when the war was opened, front open in the Pacific after the Japanese attack in Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So as one historian wrote, everyone was a target during World War II. The war killed far more civilians than soldiers, as governments, Nazi and allies took action against those deemed racial enemies. And it's not until 1943 that the Nazi defeat even seems possible. So by the end of the war, the magnitude of the devastation was incredible. There was indeed the genocide, millions dead and millions displaced all across Europe and the globe. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy, making their way through France, going eastward. And in fact, Hitler's refusal to negotiate or surrender led to the massive Allied bombing of German cities, including the infamous firebombing of Dresden over 2 days in mid-February 1945. This will lead to another myth amongst the Germans, that is that they too were victimized by the war. So at the same time that the Allied forces were advancing east from Western Europe, Soviet forces were advancing west from Eastern Europe. And Germany finally surrendered on May 8, 1945. So as I said, although the liberation brought joy and cheers across the world, even with the end of the war, violence continued. And as one historian has written, Chaos and suffering continued in the midst of the victors' thankfulness for peace. Why is that? Local and national governments were in shambles. There were violent reprisals against collaborators, anti-Semitic pogroms against Jews that had survived and returned home. And in fact, because news did not reach everyone at the same time, that is, the news of Hitler's surrender, fighting continued after Germany's surrender, from Bulgaria to France. Japan did not surrender until August 14th, 1945, after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. So one can actually make the case that it is the bombing and the use of nuclear bomb that signaled the end of World War II, and not the liberation and not Germany's surrender. So in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. It seemed to be a mass graveyard of buildings, transports, and human beings. And it's true that bombings had destroyed over 500,000 houses in France alone. In Germany, bombings had destroyed 3 million houses. In Hungary, half of the factories had been leveled along with the railroad transport. And although the war had ended, many suffered food scarcity and starvation through 1945 and 1946, especially with the harsh winters that fell on Europe in those years. So 1945 left Europeans and across the globe exhausted, homeless, starving, and traumatized by the death and suffering around them. But it also left collaborators and those guilty of war crimes and genocide largely unpunished. Those who had been defeated, occupied, and persecuted in 1940 and throughout the war now wanted revenge. And those who were defeated in 1945 felt persecuted by the victors. And at the same time, national governments had one single aim. The urgency was to rebuild. And this is the inauguration of the Marshall Plan, following the Truman Doctrine of 1947. That is the willingness of the United States to use economic and military aid to counter political crisis in Western Europe brought about by support of communism. So, in fact, the US decided to no longer be isolationist as they had with World War I, to become involved in the rebuilding of Europe. It wasn't so much to help Europe, but in fact to do both, to succeed in two political aims: to counter the possibility of the resurgence of fascism. This was the lesson from the 1940s, 30s and 40s, that economic depression had led to fascism, but also to counter communism from spreading in Europe. And this is also important because World War II ended European, global, and imperial domination of the world. And the experience of war also shaped many thinkers who, after 1945, started calling for the end of injustice, colonialism, racism, and other forms of oppression. For a couple of brief years after 1945, governments which needed to rebuild mostly believed that things could be as they once were, even though, like Britain or the Netherlands, which had also been occupied, they were heavily in debt and in utter disorder. They were especially convinced that they were still masters of vast empires. And in fact, World War II showed that imperialism was no longer tenable. The French, in fact, re-entered Vietnam in 1945 and began waging a war against the nationalist government there, calling for independence. On May 8th, 1945, Algerians too gathered to celebrate the end of the war in Europe, but also to call for the independence of their own country, Algeria. So they were celebrating victory and demonstrating against colonial rule. They fought against the French police, a riot broke out, and some Algerians attacked French settlers. and this led to incredibly brutal reprisal by the French forces. Officially, there were 10,000 casualties. In reality, 45,000 Algerians died on this day. This was the beginning of decolonization, and that movement to decolonization happened at the same time that refugees were a pressing question for Europe and France, which in 1950 had the largest number of refugees from Spanish Republicans, but also home to the largest Armenian and Jewish communities in Europe. And in the context of the emerging Cold War, the United States had become the richest and most powerful global power. And in Europe, the Soviet Union was focused on rebuilding and preserving itself. This was important because this leads to the creation of the United Nations, the realization that a war like this should never happen again. But with it, the emergence of the Cold War. And we can find maybe its origins not in 1945, but in 1943, when Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met and agreed to divide Europe into two spheres, one in the East, overseen by the Soviet Union, and one in the West, overseen by Anglo-American control. This led to the Potsdam Agreement of August 1945. And this Cold War overshadowed the need to reckon with the past and to take stock of the violence that had devastated the world.